All right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us this morning or this afternoon, depending upon where you are. And welcome to the Law Society of the Northwest Territories session on Decolonization in Action, Understanding the Deline Self-Government Agreement. We're very pleased to have with us today Danny Gaudet, who was the Deline Self-Government Chief Negotiator. We also have Max Faille and Brian Crane from Gowling, WLG. Who are going to be presenting the session. Lorraine Land is with us as well, and I think that Max is going to ask her to say a few things from time to time as well. So a couple of notes before we get started. If you could keep your mics on mute, that would be great. It eliminates all the background noise. We will be running the chat function. So if you've got any questions, please send them through the chat function. I will pass them on to the participants. And finally, we're recording this session. It will show up on the Law Society's YouTube channel later today or tomorrow so that you can go back and review it. And others who weren't able to join us today will be able to participate later on. So with that, I think, Max, I'm going to turn things over to you and let you take it away.
Terrific. Thanks so much, Glenn. Welcome, everyone. I feel this is sort of like an episode of Romper Room. You know, I'm aging myself a little bit. I see Lorraine, I see Lee, I see Carol. But anyway, it's great to be in your virtual company, and thanks, Glenn, so much, and to the Law Society for inviting us to present today on Deline Self-Government. And I especially want to thank my co-presenters, Danny Gaudet, who was, as mentioned, the lead negotiator for his community of Deline, and who is joining us from Deline. And my partner, the legendary Brian Crane, who was the lead legal advisor in the self-government process to Deline, and who was kind enough to involve me from time to time in the file and give me a bit of a front row seat to this vital work that is ultimately, as the title of the session suggests, you know, truly decolonization in action. And one of the great, certainly one of the great privileges of my career thus far is to have been in some small way involved in this very important agreement. Tuesday will mark the 4th anniversary of the coming into force of the Deline Self-Government Agreement. So it's quite fitting that we are taking the time to discuss it today. And I think when one considers what needs to happen in our world today to close the intolerable socioeconomic gaps between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, to heal the wounds of our collective past and present, I think high on any list has to be the restoration of self-government to Indigenous communities, to enable those communities to free themselves from the constraints of the Indian Act and to truly take control over their own destinies. And indeed, what evidence there is that I have seen, and it's fairly limited, but nevertheless, what evidence there is seems to suggest that and support the conclusion that communities that are operating under self-government have indeed fared better and continue to fare better than those that remain under the Indian Act. So it's extremely important work, and so it's great to be discussing it today. And we're really grateful for everyone for having joined us. So by way of a quick outline of today's session, and as Glenn mentioned, we'll welcome questions, you know, throughout. But what we thought we would do is, first of all, ask Brian to provide a bit of historical context, focusing on Treaty 11 and the underlying Statut Dene Métis Comprehensive Land Claim Agreement that kind of is sort of the midwife of the self-government agreement in some ways. Then ask Danny to provide a bit of an overview of the Deline people and community and its vision for self-government, followed by a bit of an overview of the self-government agreement, its structure and its key elements coming into force and transition. That will be stick-handled by myself and Brian. And then finally ask Danny to tell us a little bit about the experience with self-government so far. And that's where we may also ask Lorraine to jump in and talk about implementation and sort of go forward issues. So with that, Brian, over to you.
Okay, I have to unmute. So thank you, Max, and hello to everybody. We're not doing very much travel these days, but Max told me he was up in Whitehorse last weekend, so it doesn't seem to have restrained him very much. Most of my colleagues are in our home offices, and we're all getting used to this new reality. I've been asked to give a bit of the historical background just to get the discussion rolling. And I think it's fair to say really that in the Sahtu region, which includes the 5 main communities there, it has a number of regional components as well, but the main source to any arrangements in the Sahtu is found, Max mentioned Treaty 11, but it's fundamentally, I think, the self-government is merged in the land claim agreement. So the Sahtu, Dene, and Métis comprehensive land claim agreement provides the sort of institutional framework for self-government. When those Dene Métis negotiations were underway through the 80s and right up until the Dene Métis arrangements broke apart, and in the first 2 agreements, regional agreements, there was no disposition on the part of the federal government to negotiate self-government as an integral part of the land claim agreement. And that may have been based in the practical reality that the Dene and Métis had separate institutions themselves, separate negotiating teams, and it was only in the early 1980s that they developed a joint secretariat and negotiated together. So there was just so much that could be coped with in the course of the land claim negotiations. So the Sahtu, Dene, and Métis land claim provided that the federal government would negotiate self-government on a community basis, and that negotiation would take place after the land claim was settled. There was a provision in the agreement setting out a framework agreement. So a framework agreement was already negotiated, and that government would negotiate, and government in this sense was also the GNWT. They would negotiate self-government arrangements on a case-by-case basis when communities had decided to move forward. Those provisions still apply, of course, and what we have seen in the Sahtu region over time is self-government negotiations, first with Deline, then with Talita and Norman Wells, and more recently with Fort Good Hope and Cola Lake. And each of those have established community tables. This was somewhat different than the approach in the Gwich'in area, which decided to negotiate on a regional basis together. At least that's how things started out. When the Tlichong Agreement came along in 2005, government had modified its policy, and the self-government component was in fact negotiated at the same time as the treaty. So the self-government arrangements were all put in place in the Tlichong Treaty, and there was no need to have community self-government. After that, of course, there were other tables established in the South, in the South Slave, and regional approaches were also adopted in the Dehcho region. But these negotiations did not move ahead as fast as the self-government in Deline. Deline became the first self-government agreement. Now, to understand fully the effect of the treaty, one has to look at what it actually did. And the treaty had the effect of providing that settlement lands and compensation and resource revenues would all be transferred to the tribal organization, which was then called the Sahtu Tribal Council. That was what the treaty said. But after the treaty was in place, the Sahtu communities, the Dene, the Dene bands and the Métis locals met together and worked out a new internal arrangement under which the assets were transferred in a variety of ways. The land, the settlement lands, were transferred to what was called the district land corporation, so that each district, each internal district, had its own lands. In the case of Deline, it ended up with a body called the Deline Land Corporation. That was, and in the case of the of Fort Good Hope or Casho, there were other land corporations involved, but the land title and management was done locally. This again is a contrast with the Gwich'in, where land was transferred to a central body. The compensation monies and the revenues from resource revenues were also transferred, but they went to the Sahtu regional body and were held in a body called the Sahtu Trust, which held and invested those monies, and periodically the interest was distributed to the various communities. So that was sort of the underlying structure of the land claim. And as I said, self-government was not negotiated at that time. But very shortly after, the Deline decided to proceed with self-government negotiations for the Deline community. Those negotiations began in 1997. Later, in the Sahtu region, Tulita, Fort Good Hope, the Norman Wells Métis, and Colville Lake each started their own self-government negotiations. And these negotiations did not move as fast as Deline, and Deline became the first and so far the only independent self-government agreement in the Northwest Territories. And it occupies a very important sort of place in the overall history of the region. I would say at this point that we'll be talking about the self-government model, but this model was the result of very strong views expressed by the community itself. And on that, I will turn things over, if I may, to Danny to explain the community's ambitions and objectives in going for self-government when they did, just a year or so after the land claim was in force.
Thank you, Brian. thank you to the Law Society for inviting, I was going to say my team, but they're no longer my team. I'd like to say hello to Brian and Max. Sorry, I'm just going to close something off. I'm running this through my phone, so I'm getting some interference. I haven't been in the office since Decolonization government was established September 1st, 2016. When I walked out of the office, I said goodbye, and haven't been back there yet. Just personally to find my own self, and it's taken a while to do that, and I'm actually really enjoying life now. So it was basically a 20-year journey, and I always thank my team that worked with us, because we literally kept our team intact for 20 years. We've lost some people along the way, passed on, and we replaced them with some very dedicated people. I also like to thank the federal government and the territorial government negotiators and teams they had on our table. It's important to understand that they've took away from their lives to be at our table for years, and in the end, they almost became very, very good friends, family and stuff like that. So you tend to know all the issues of everybody, and rather than use it against them, you take your time to support them and help them out. So I just wanted to say that. I want to thank everybody again. When we started the self-government agreement, basically I grew up in Deline all my life. I've seen the transition from dog teams and one-room houses with no running water and no power and stuff like that, and I've seen it to where it comes to today. And a lot of the learning and everything I've seen is from the elders, comes from the land, comes from the animals, comes from the plants and trees. Although I didn't do as much as I wanted to do on the land, because I've taken off to residential school. After I finished school, I kind of dabbled with government and trying to understand what I wanted to do. So going forward, I've had this passion to come back home. So I moved back home in 1991, and basically just didn't have a job. I left a real good career with the government of Northwest Territories. I was basically a superintendent by the time I was 25 years old, and I've for MACA, and I really understood governance quite a bit. But I also seen a big disconnect between governance and its application of policies and laws to communities. And I got very familiar with the treaty and the Indian Act and how it's applied to the bands also. And, you know, if you look at both pieces of legislation, municipal legislation and the Banned Indian Act, they're fairly similar. And I really tried to figure out and understand what was going on. And when I got home, the community needed help right away when dealing with its businesses. So I got involved that way. And I really connected with the elders again. And when I got back to this idea that I'm going to stay in Dillon as basically as long as I can, I basically stayed since then. And in 1996, we started the discussions. But even before that, the community lived nomadically around Great Bear Lake, interacted with all the other communities, but I would say with all the other families, because there was really no communities. And they were quite connected with land and all its resources, and they've gathered basically all their food, they got all their laws, their direction and all that from basically the land and its animals. And then being basically thrusted into a community under the band creation and under the Indian Act, being told that the kids had to go to school. They started creating the community, and it started out probably fine because we had only one piece of legislation applying to us, was the Indian Act. And through the transfer of powers to the government of Northwest Territories, municipal powers are transferred. And so all of a sudden, the communities in the Northwest Territories ended up with two functioning governments. One, I always say, was 95% politically legitimate because it represented all the people, and the other one represented basically a public government system that nobody really belonged to, and but it had all the money. So one had all the political legitimacy, and the municipal government had no political legitimacy, but it had all the resources and had all the money. And over the years, when they were talking about the Berger inquiry and they're talking about land claims, all the former elders and chiefs always talked about, we want to do self-government. We want to work and we want to govern our lands. That was way back in the 60s. We found documentation in the early 60s, late 60s into the 70s. And so it wasn't a new idea from our community to actually start talking about this idea of creating a self-government agreement. What really tipped it forward was there was this argument between the bands and the municipality. Although it's your brother and sister sitting on the other fence, or even you sitting on both fences, you just change hats. And it created a lot of problems in the community because every time we wanted to, let's say, create a simple park, for example, the band would have that wish, representing 95% of the people. And then when we bring it to the territorial sector, which is the municipality, they would say no. And so it became, started creating dysfunction in the community. And our communities always pride itself on working together and sharing and helping and supporting one another. And it didn't make sense that we actually ended up with two systems. And the community, back in 1993, decided, well, under current legislation, let's see what we could try to do. So they simultaneously, while they were negotiating the land claim with Mr. Crane and his team, they created what we call a charter community. And the charter community basically is under territorial legislation. It's same form as a hamlet or a city, town, village, pretty much same powers. It just, the head of the council looks a little bit different, and that's pretty much all that changes in that system. But what we thought it would do at a minimum was start getting the people to work together, and that the band would have some authority over the spending and the planning of the community. And it's one thing to have the paperwork there in front of you saying, okay, you guys function this way now, but the personalities never changed, and people still really fought hard to look after the band, and people still fought hard to look after the municipality. So there were still issues. And in 1995, the community decided, well, let's pull this apart now. It's not working. Let's pull it apart. Let's start looking at self-government, and which was negotiated in the land claim agreement that Mr. Crane referred to. And in the land claim, there's sections in the land claim that deal with the approach to self-government, and it's already predetermined the principles and how we would approach self-government, and then all the subject matters that we would negotiate. It was quite an exhaustive list, but in hindsight, when you look at it, we could have probably added more to that list. But I'll tell you another approach we've taken at the end. So we finally said, no, let's keep the charter community intact. No use breaking them apart when we already got them together, just to put them back together after we have self-government. It wasn't a hard decision to go down that road, because the community has always been trying to go down that road, and having one government, one system, working for the same group of people. The idea would be, well, how do we become more efficient? How do we utilize more resources? How do we get people working together? How do we get communication amongst our people? And then work towards what we call a common vision. So I talked a little bit about the vision now, and the vision basically comes from the elders, and it comes from the prophet Aya and the predictions about the future for our people. A simple prediction, I'll give you an example. Water would become the most valuable resource in the world. And Great Bear Lake water would be the only water, fresh water in the world that is drinkable. So thousands or millions of people would come to our area. That's one of the predictions. And when you listen to that, you try to say, well, really, is that really going to happen, like to the entire world? And when you watch TV today, you think about it. 20 years ago, you asked that question. 20 years later, you look at and watch TV and you say, well, wow, it's actually coming. And so the elders are saying we have to figure out a way that we can govern the area and have some control over water. And we got to do it now. We can't wait. We got to bring our people together. We got to strengthen our families. We got to strengthen our community. So we got to strengthen our culture and our customs and beliefs. And when people come, they're going to recognize that we've done a good job as stewards of the land that people can now all enjoy, and they can come and share it with us. And when they do come, at least they have some form of governance that will continue to maintain that even though millions of people come. So this vision of the elders' predictions, now try to interpret it. And that's just one of, he's got hundreds. And a lot of them has come true already, but try to interpret that into modern governance was a feat in itself. It's we had to do a lot of educating. We had to do a lot of research and understanding how laws are developed and how they're applied. What rights should we take on? What rights not necessary for us to take on, et cetera, et cetera. So we thought to ourselves, well, the vision of the elders and the prophecies would be our guiding posts. We will never change our story at the table. We will never veer away from the direction we're heading. We're just going to keep telling the same story and same story. And over time, we've got the federal government starting to open up a very restrictive, I would say, mandate. I think when they first started, they had no clue how to deal with us. And we're very fortunate that we had some very strong, caring, dedicated people on the other side, the federal government, that went into the system to change the mandate. And so we spent a lot of time educating the negotiators about the traditions and the cultures and the beliefs and its customs, and we never stopped doing that, and we did that all the time. We've taken all our negotiators in the bush. We spent tons of time going hunting and fishing with them, and they thought they were died and gone to heaven because they were fishing and hunting so much, although we were working and changing them. And in the end, they started understanding what is it that we're trying to do. And it had no, I guess, underlining approach in terms of trying to trick them into something that we wanted in terms of more jurisdiction. It was, here's a simple approach. This is all we're trying to do. This is what we want to achieve once we have self-government. And you need to alter your mandates to allow us to do that. And they went into the system, and they really changed their mandates quite a bit. And we just kept pushing and pushing and pushing. If both governments had their way, we would just look like a municipality. And I think we've done really well with moving the goalposts, and we stretch it as far as we can. And I guess one of the important things that I was alluded to earlier was, I wish it didn't take 20 years. I wish it would have took 1 or 2 years, because I had a lot of energy at the time. I was gung-ho to, build strong, healthy families with the strong, healthy community, and a productive community, not only in our area, but a productive community in the territories, in the Northwest Territories, or Canada. How do we make, this country work together? How do we make this country accept Indigenous people, that we can be a very, very productive group of people that can really, really, really help make Canada a great place to live. I lost a lot of energy just negotiating, because we've taken on the uranium file simultaneously. And basically we worked for 5 years straight for 365 days almost. And that took us a lot of energy out of us also. But in the end, I was grateful. I think in hindsight, if we knew that governments would accept the direction we were heading, our vision, our approach, we could have just simply agreed to certain things and started self-government in year 2, for example, or year 3, whatever it would have took. At least we start building. Over time, as a government, they could sit down with their counterparts, federal, territorial governments, and draw down jurisdictions. How that looks, they can debate that as staff and the politicians at the time. So I'm thinking to myself, we could have done that, but in the end we didn't. We fought really hard to try to push the goalposts, and in the end it came down to me, and I said, we talked about it at the table, and I said, look, we're not going to get everything we want, so let's start focusing on how can we negotiate for future jurisdictions and bring it into the self-government agreement. Let's not close the door. We certainly are a moving target. We're a live institution that's going to change with time. It has to be able to draw down new jurisdictions. It has to be able to deal with million people coming to Great Bear Lake. It's going to have to change, and governments, you're going to have to recognize that. So you don't need all the rights today, in my mind. You can develop a process to negotiate the rights later on down the road. I advise that to all our other communities and negotiators, because you could use that energy you have right now to start fixing your communities. We want to get our communities off dependency. We want to make them independent. Well, why wouldn't you give us the tools to do that? Why wouldn't you allow us to take over the health and social service issues that are in the community? Why don't you just take your systems, modify it to the approach that we want, and let's start getting our people off the abuse and the drugs, the alcohol, the dependencies, the mental issues. Because once we do that, we want to move them to a productive area where they're now trained, and they're also got a job now. They got a career now, and let's get them into their own homes. Let's get rid of social housing. We don't need it if everybody's working they're in their own homes. We could literally change the lives of people if you just give us the tools. So that took years to relay that message finally to the governments. And I think with the last 5 years, they just said, these guys are not giving up. They're not going away. They're not just going to accept what we're going to give them. Let's start figuring out how we can make it all work. And the last 5 years was really enjoyable. Probably the first 5 years, we didn't even move an inch. So that's 10 years for you. The other 10, I don't know what we did. But that's kind of the history as to how we ended up doing self-government. I needed to tell a little bit of the story at the beginning as respect to the elders and how we got to where we are, because that's important if you're going to go down this process. I mean, and plus, I think if you're going to do self-government, you have to do it because you want to make your people better. But it's not only just for your people. And I told Canada, I said, we didn't negotiate self-government to separate from you. We negotiate self-government to bring you closer to us now. Now you got your billions and billions of dollars of budget that now I can have access to. Now you got to come closer to me because we're going to try to figure out how we're going to solve these problems. So it's not, we didn't look at it as a separation of governments and we're going on our own, because that's what everybody, after we finished and as we were negotiating, everybody thinks we're going to go on our own and we got nothing to do with territorial government, federal government. No, I bring you guys closer. Now you're going to follow my rules and my policies and how we're going to address fixing our communities and our people. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Danny. Extremely helpful and enlightening. And I must say, there's no doubt that in order to get where Deline has reached, it rests on the leadership that Danny and others showed throughout the process, and without which they would not be where they are today. And it's such a crucial element in these discussions is to have leadership, and as Danny says, on all sides, not just on the Indigenous side, but on the federal side and on the territorial side as well, to get to a good place and where people are really truly collaborating and working together and trying to come up with solutions. And that was, I think this table was, 90% of the time was marked by that kind of collaboration. And the other thing I think that Danny was incredibly effective at, and that can't be underestimated either, is the engagement and the involvement of the community throughout the process. There were elders sitting at each and every one of the negotiation sessions. And so they were aware of what was going on throughout the process. And they were engaged and consulted and relied upon throughout the process. And that was crucial. It was crucial in the design and the structure of the ultimate agreement. And it was crucial in securing the support for the agreement. I mean, ultimately you spend 20 years, as Danny says, negotiating these things, and it has to go to a vote, and the community has to be comfortable with that agreement. And unless you brought them along the entire time, then there's a real risk that the community will just reject it, and they'll see it as something that was kind of negotiated behind closed doors by a handful of individuals who feel distant from them. And Deline is, I think, a model in terms of that particular approach. And as Danny says, I mean, it was also very important throughout the process that the negotiation was really anchored in the culture and the spirituality of Deline, and that sort of had actual, sort of real tangible outputs in the structure of the agreement itself. So, for instance, when Danny talks about the prophecies of the prophet Aya about people coming to the community, well, that was very important because on the one hand, Deline wanted and did ultimately adopt an Aboriginal public government that represents not just the Indigenous people in the community, but that represents everyone in the Deline district. And that was important to do that in order to truly have, sort of a single government model in which everyone could be represented. And I suppose in the sort of shorter term, that didn't necessarily present a major issue because there are relatively few non-Indigenous people, living in the community. There are some, but relatively few. But if we, the prophecy that Danny mentioned about, thousands or millions of people coming to the community one day to have access to this enormous reservoir of fresh water, really weighed on that structure and the idea that, well, there could come a time when that Indigenous voice could in fact be drowned out, in part or very significantly. And so that had to be sort of taken into account and was taken into account in how ultimately the government was structured for Deline. So in that regard, in terms of the structure, what does the self-government agreement do? Well, as Danny and Brian mentioned, I mean, it replaces the numerous previous bodies that were governing in Deline and that were engaged in these sort of fairly frequent jurisdictional tugs of war and turf battles and so on. So it replaces the land corporation that was established under the land claim. It replaces, of course, the Indian Act Band, and it replaces the charter community to establish a single Aboriginal public government that, as I mentioned, represents all residents in the Deline district, regardless of their status or eligibility as land claim beneficiaries. But that in turn, as I mentioned, presents certain challenges since the land claim continues to operate. It continues to provide for and recognize certain Aboriginal rights and provides for land and other capital assets that flow to the Deline First Nation citizens, not everyone living in Deline, but those are rights, of course, that those individuals hold in their capacity as Indigenous people. So it will obviously, that creates an issue in terms of who has a voice in decisions that may relate to the land claim or that are ultimately tied to or associated with rights under the land claim. And so the structure of government reflects that the need to balance that through the establishment of a beneficiaries board or the DGGR, which advises in relation to land claim matters, and also through the fact that only those members of the legislative body that's established under the land claim, the DKK, only those who are themselves land claim beneficiaries can vote in regard to land claim matters. And so that's how Deline managed to sort of fit kind of a round peg into a square hole when it comes to having both the concept of a public Aboriginal government while also ensuring the necessary linkages and accountability relating to land claim benefits and so on that are obviously exclusively for the benefit of those participants under the land claim. Another feature, and again, this comes back to those prophecies, is that the land, or that the self-government agreement provides that Deline law can require that up to 75% of the seats on their legislative body, the DKK, as well as the Equatide, who is the lead of the government, be held by Deline citizens. So there is that ability to ensure that representativity of Deline First Nation citizens to guard against that possibility of the dilution of the Indigenous voice within the Deline Aboriginal public government. So the basic governmental structure is a Deline constitution. It was drafted and approved by the community. An Equatide or chief or lead of the Deline government, the DGG, the DKK, which is the main council, which is sort of the legislative body, and has general supervision of the Deline government operations. An executive committee of that body, the DKK, which also operates as a finance committee, and it exercises sort of day-to-day supervision of the government. There is an elders council that provides guidance to that legislative body on matters, and also appoints one member to the legislative body. There is, as I've mentioned, this beneficiaries board that has primary responsibility for managing beneficiary services and land claim matters, and advising, again, the legislative body with respect to land claim related matters. There is a justice council that is to operate as an internal appeal body, and also make determinations as to breaches and sanctions of Deline laws and so on. And then the final element of governance is an annual community gathering that the government has to report to and receive input from the community. So that's the basic structure, and then I'll just touch very briefly on a few other aspects of potential interest with respect to the agreement. One is the certainty provision, and these often are sort of points of significant debate within Indigenous agreements generally, treaties and otherwise. And here we have a kind of a non-assertion model. So Deline agree not to assert an Aboriginal right to self-government other than in a manner that is compatible with the self-government agreement. So there's no extinguishment of self-governance rights or other rights. Rather, there's an agreement to not assert. And there's a recognition that new rights relating to self-government could come to be recognized over time through court decisions and otherwise, and a recognition that if that happens, that those should be incorporated into the agreement. And that's something that's sometimes called a sort of an orderly process methodology in which you're confined to those rights and those structures as they're defined in the agreement, but there's still an open-endedness in the sense that if new rights come along that really ought to be incorporated into the agreement, then the expectation is that that will happen and the agreement will be amended to reflect that. In terms of jurisdiction, obviously the meat of the agreement is the recognition of various jurisdictions of the Deline government in key matters. And in each case, the scope of the jurisdiction and any limitations on that jurisdiction are, of course, defined under the agreement. And I think it's fair to say that the jurisdiction is more or less expansive depending on the subject matter. And it's also fair to say that Canada and GNWT insisted on a retention of a certain level of control and oversight in regard to the exercise of jurisdictions, depending on what those jurisdictions were, which is, I think, was and continues to be a bit of a point of tension, is sort of how clean a break is it from sort of the supervision from down south, whether it's in Yellowknife or further south in Ottawa. And that was obviously a very tricky aspect of negotiating this agreement and continues to be a tricky conversation in subsequent agreements. So there's a balancing act here, and as I say, I think it depends on which particular jurisdiction as to how extensive that kind of ongoing, somewhat paternalistic role is maintained, or in some cases fairly paternalistic role is maintained vis-a-vis the exercise of certain jurisdictions. So that's done through certain limitations on jurisdiction. It's done through the concept of core principles and objectives as defined by the territories, and language that requires, for instance, that Deline retain or meet certain standards that are equal to or that exceed those standards of the NWT. So there are these various mechanisms that continue to tie, if you will, the exercise of Deline jurisdiction to how jurisdictions in those areas are exercised at the territorial level, generally, and to some extent, I suppose, at the federal level. So what are those jurisdictions that are recognized? And not all of them are of course taken up, and the idea is that they're there and they're taken up over time as the capacity to take up those jurisdictions is developed. K-12 education, which includes the certification of teachers, but the GNWT curriculum framework still applies. Requirements for grade 12 graduation still apply. So that's an example of how you have that balance as between, sort of true self-government and a retention of some ongoing role or oversight or involvement of the GNWT. Early childhood education and childcare similarly, and that includes licensing of facilities, but again, must be compatible with GNWT laws, standards, and core principles and objectives. Adult education and post-secondary education, but post-secondary only with respect to programs that are established by the Deline government. Local services, which includes, I think probably the key aspect there is the licensing of businesses and business activities and people engaged in those businesses. So that is a jurisdiction, fairly, to my mind, quite an unfettered jurisdiction on the part of the Deline government. Adoption of Deline First Nation citizens throughout the Northwest Territories. So this is one of the sort of few examples where the jurisdiction of the government is kind of territorial wide as opposed to district wide. So with respect to Deline First Nation citizens, they have jurisdiction with respect to adoption, as well as jurisdiction relating to adoption for persons who are resident in Deline district, whether they're Deline First Nation citizens or not. Child and Family Services, again, although here again, I would say that there is a significant ability on the part of the GNWT to kind of reinsert itself and exercise control if it believes that things aren't being run properly, and in particular, if the best interests of the children, in its view, are not being, met and satisfied. So there's a significant ability for the GNWT to reinsert itself into the governance of Deline in respect of that particular jurisdiction. Gaming and gambling, health limited to traditional healing services of the Sahtu and Dene and Métis people, training, certification, that sort of thing associated with traditional healing. Social housing falls within Deline jurisdiction, other than landlord-tenant relations and building and construction codes, which remains territorial. Income support for those who are within the Deline district. Language, culture, spirituality, economic development, tourism, and that sort of thing in a manner that's consistent with the other jurisdictions that are set out. Prohibition and control sale of liquor. So these are sort of the types of controls with some tweaks that exist under sort of the bylaw powers of an Indian Act band are similarly, retained and exercised by the Deline Gaultier government. Settlement lands, critically, use management, administration, control, and protection of those lands, including granting interest in those lands, licensing of businesses, trespass, controlling the use of weapons, sale and transport of weapons, that sort of thing. And then when it comes to the broader issues of regulation of land, water, environment on settlement lands, that's, I would say, is subject to a broader regulatory framework under the agreement, federal law, NWT law, and so on. With respect to taxation, the Deline Gaultier government has jurisdiction regarding taxation of Deline First Nations citizens within Deline lands, but provision for the negotiation of agreements, taxation agreements that could allow the Deline Gaultier government to exercise a broader taxation jurisdiction with respect to persons who are not Deline First Nation citizens, but who reside within Deline lands. As far as the Indian Act tax exemption is concerned, of course, less of an issue in the Northwest Territory, since there were almost no reserves in the territory, and so that, which is a flashpoint in a lot of other contexts, less so in Deline, but nevertheless, under the Indian Act, Deline citizens could benefit from the tax exemption if they resided, outside of Deline, or if they shop outside of Deline on reserve lands, here in Vancouver or Ottawa or elsewhere. So not an insignificant concession, one insisted upon by Canada at these tables generally, is the sort of phasing out of that tax exemption over time, over a sort of an 8-year period with respect to transaction taxes, sort of GST, and a 12-year period with respect to income tax, and so on and so forth. Jurisdiction with respect to justice, in regard to the administration of Deline laws, in essence, as well as the establishment of this Justice Council to hear appeals and to make determinations as to breaches and sanctions with respect to Deline laws. Enforcement of those laws also falls to the Deline government. And then there's a number of jurisdictions, and Danny alluded to this as well, that are mentioned but are deferred for sort of 10 years, 10 plus years, unless the parties agree otherwise. So marriage, trusteeship, and guardianship, wills and estates, those are kind of punted to future negotiation. Brian, I'll turn it over to you then to talk a little bit about entry into force and transition. And then after that, turn it back over to Danny to tell us a little bit about what the experience has been with self-government so far, I guess more from the perspective of a citizen and a voter, since, as he says, he sort of walked out the door that day and hasn't been back since, which is quite understandable given the blood, sweat, and tears he has poured into this project that's eaten up a good chunk of his life. But Brian, over to you if you can talk to us a little bit about the entry into force and transition.
I think, thanks, Max. I don't want to take too long on this, so we can have some feedback from the audience and some questions. This is quite a list of powers, and it's understandable that the scope of those powers will depend very much on the financial resources to the community, and also the human resources that are available to manage the jurisdictions. I think after the agreement was signed, and there was of course the approval, as we mentioned already, of the Constitution. And that was an important step from the point of view of the federal government, particularly since it signified the approval of the community to the new institutional setup and the new management setup. And that was approved. The Constitution was drafted and discussed at the community through a series of workshops. And when the vote came, it was virtually unanimous. So there was full community support for it. At the end of the process, when the agreements were all ready to go, there was also a ratification vote. And the ratification vote in the community was over 90%. So that there was very strong community support that came into play. There was an effective date set up under the agreement that there was going to be a transition period. And in that transition period, there was a transition team with many people contributing to that process. And there was quite a lot of workshops that were done in the community. Local laws were drafted, the manuals, HR manuals, and such were prepared. On the taxation front, there were tax administration agreements worked out, so that under the present arrangements, there is a substantial revenue flow representing in particular, the personal income tax from the persons who are actually resident in the community. So there's the number of persons that are actually living there, their taxes. This includes people who are not members or belong to other communities. The people that are living there, their taxes all flow to the community through tax administration agreements. So this provides for very substantial revenue. There's also a substantial amount of federal funding going to the support of the government, the new expenses that are required to set up new institutions, and the operating costs and so forth. So, and then there is the three big sectors of activity are the local services, which were managed by the charter community. All of those were melded into the new government. That's the management of local services, the roads, and maintenance of infrastructure and waste disposal and so forth. And then the other side was all the land claim assets were all put into the mix. So all of the lands, municipal lands and settlement lands were transferred to the new government from the existing land corporations. And then you finally had the management of land claim assets that also was dealt with. So it was a huge machine, if you like, that had to be melded together. And in the result, it was, I think, a period of some difficulty, some transitioning at the community level. Fortunately, I think most of the existing employees, they were all transferred to the new government, so there was an ease there. Some of the institutions weren't set up right away and functioned over time. Beneficiaries Board being one of those institutions that I think took some time to get into place. And so all of these things took a lot of time before the effective date. And on the effective date, everything was transferred to the new government. There had to be an election, and the election of the first elections were all governed by the agreement, so that came into place quite speedily. So I think I might just pause there and sort of indicate that the final piece we have here is to for Danny and possibly Lorraine, if she is able to talk about the issues that have arisen in a more general sense and the challenges in getting the machinery of self-government going. So.
Thanks very much, Brian. Yeah, Danny, do you want to lead us off, and then we'll ask Lorraine to jump in as well?
Sure. I think one of the things that we try to communicate with governments. Can you guys hear me? Hello?
Yep, we're good.
Okay. I think one of the things we tried to communicate with both governments, especially the federal, because they were funding things throughout the negotiations, is that we needed to work on starting to build capacity and infrastructure so that when the transition of the new government taking over, it would happen automatically. They started out supporting the whole concept and stuff like that, but over time they just stopped. They stopped doing it, and that causes a lot of problems when you're taking over, because I think in the end, a lot of times we want to send this message to our members that, you know, self-government is good, but if it's not being implemented properly, the first thing that comes out of people's mouths is that, well, see, we told you it's self-government is no good. So we wanted to make sure that we had a real smooth transition from old to the new, and literally we wanted to build the structure, we wanted to build legislation, we wanted to build infrastructure, we wanted to prepare so that and build capacity along the way, start training our staff and start training people that are interested in working for the government, work on in-house lawyers that maybe come from the community, all those type of things. And all that takes resources, and some governments were interested in it and some governments weren't. So, and that's politics for you. But in the end, when we start making the transition, we ended up having a real good team that worked on transition for us, and they did a real good job at making sure that we sort of crossed the I's and dotted all the T's, crossed the T's and dotted all the I's, and made sure that you know, we had a list. I think going forward, our community didn't realize the amount of work and that it would take to get the government up and running properly, and then communicating continuously with the people, because we didn't have the capacity, and we certainly needed to do an in-depth analysis as to what we actually needed to implement the government. And a lot of the assessments weren't taken serious. They weren't too interested in making sure that they built the right departments with all the department heads and all the staff, and understanding, you know, the principles behind the agreement and what was negotiated, why it was negotiated. They kind of just said, the government said, well, we'll take over now. Thank you guys, and we'll see you, and we'll figure it out. And today, I would say, today they're still figuring it out, but you know, we all have an interest in this, both territorial, federal, and the community, and making sure that it runs right, because you're going to be here for the long haul, and you want to provide a service to your people. You want to start changing and moving from independence to dependency. We shouldn't be nitpicking about the government and trying to build it, you know, 4 or 5 years later. We should already be functioning, and we should be active and participating, understanding what's going on in territorial government and federal government, working with them to enhance some of the programs and services that they've been delivering. Max alluded to education, for example. We on purposely agreed that the territorial government should retain the learning outcomes of K-12. we did that on purpose because one, we knew they weren't even meeting the learning outcomes in the community. When you're producing grade 12 graduate at a grade 9 level, well, obviously you're not meeting the standards. And that's a territorial government under that system. Well, it's still like that today. So when you can measure against that standard and where you're supposed to be, there's a gap. And the gap could be simply the parents not being involved, or it could be the community not being involved, or we're really underfunded in education. So there's various things, but that discussion has to happen. And in the end, to make sure we implement this thing right, the assessments of these departments should happen, and we need to do it in a manner that we're going to improve the system. Might cost you a little bit more money to do now, but if we can get people off social dependency, we'll save you a lot of money in the long run. So implementation was a real important thing, and we're still struggling at it. Thanks, Max.
Thanks so much, Danny. Extremely important insights there. Lorraine, do you mind jumping in a little bit? And sorry to put you on the
Sure.
spot, but maybe tell us a little bit about
That's
where
okay.
things are at and things have been and things are going.
Yeah, thank you. I would just echo the comments that were made so far, and some of Danny's comments, particularly about what has been learned. So I just wanted to acknowledge first just the enormous amount of work that went into establishing all the components of self-government. So a mountain moved over 20 years to the point where 4 years ago, the new government was in place, and then suddenly had this huge basket of all new institutions, all new laws, and so on. So of course, that's a challenging situation. And Max and Brian and Danny are correct. There was so much work that went into making sure everything was there on day one. But of course, it takes time for all of that to roll out, including the headspace mindset to change, both for community leadership and for the governments that they're dealing with. So if you're talking about it in terms of decolonization doesn't happen overnight. You went from a system of having a Indian Act Band Council structure, plus a municipal structure, plus a land corporation structure, and suddenly one integrated structure with a whole new administration. So of course, there have been some challenges, including what's needed to build up the capacity of these important fundamental institutions of this new government. If you take the Appeal Council, for instance, the DKDK, which is the appeal body for decisions of the government, well, it takes time for an appeal body like that to be established and then to develop their own procedural laws that reflect procedural fairness, and not just Dene perspectives, but some of the perspectives that are unique to Deline. As you heard the other speakers say, there are some unique aspects about Deline in terms of that community vision, and particularly reliance on the prophecies from the prophet Aya. So those are the types of things that would need to be considered in, for instance, establishing procedural rules for an appeal body. I would echo two specific things that Danny pointed out. Danny pointed out how there were the options of drawing down all the jurisdictions at once, and then the movement was made towards drawing down certain jurisdictions. But Danny made the point that there were ways in which self-government could have commenced at year 2 and aspects could have been drawn down. And I think that is one of the challenges, is that this enormous amount of work went in to establishing a new government. And then on day 1, the new community leadership had to deal with all of these new structures of government, completely new laws, new ways of doing things. And that did create its own challenges. I mean, there's pros and cons about whether you do things incrementally or all at once, but that was definitely a challenge. And people are still getting used to the new structures. How does this work? How is this the same or different than the way things used to happen for the land corporation or the municipality or the previous Indian Act Council, for instance? One of the biggest challenges, for instance, has been as has been noted, the beneficiaries board is a very important structure in the government to ensure that the rights of the Dene and Métis are protected in the new government structure, which is a public government. The challenge is so many aspects of decision making touch on issues that have to do with the rights and interests of beneficiaries under the land claim. So you have two decision-making bodies, the main council and the beneficiaries board, who are trying to understand how their roles interrelate when the consent of the beneficiaries board is needed for anything that touches on land claim assets and rights and benefits. So that's an example of the kinds of challenges that the new government is working through. But you know, we didn't. Canadian Confederation, for instance, continues to change. We don't establish a government and have everything in place from day one. Government naturally evolves, and that's what's happening with the Deline government as well. And it's very interesting to be working with them through this process. And I just want to again acknowledge just the folks who spoke to you today, just the enormous amount of work that they put in to establishing the whole structure of that self-government process is just, it's a very, very impressive, and I just wanted to honor that today, and thanks.
Thank you very much, Lorraine, for your kind words and for your thoughts. Most appreciated, and for all the good work that you're doing in you know, taking those next steps that are absolutely critical. Obviously, you know, having it all on paper is one thing, but turning it into a reality is a whole other kettle of fish, and that's kind of where the rubber truly hits the road. Yeah.
Can I add one thing,
please?
Just before the questions start, I think one of the things too Brian talked about was, you know, I kind of like this story because the story was told to me at the beginning of self-government and negotiations, and one of the elders come to me and they said, you know, it's been predicted for us, so don't worry. When time comes, self-government will fly through. And so I always kept that story and I thought about it, and they always keep reminding me, and sometimes you get tired and you want to finish up. But one of the things that when we brought this agreement through the territorial government, we had no issues and no questions asked by the politicians, and literally passed it in 3 readings. I think they did it over 2 sessions, but basically did it in 3 readings in 2 days. And then the PC government went to the federal government, and I was on my way to Edmonton, and with our team, we're going to Ottawa to watch Parliament and then maybe get to watch the Senate. We left Edmonton thinking, well, we'll be in Ottawa for a while to watch both sessions, and I think Parliament passed the agreement, and they did it in basically 1 sitting. And other agreements that gone through the House basically had to go back because there was 800 or 600 or 500 amendments, and there was 0 to the Deline agreement. And then when it went through the Senate, them too, they basically did it in 1 sitting, and 0 opposition. We had both houses, all the parties 100% unanimously passed it with 0 opposition. I just wanted to say that because the elder said that, but it also shows how much work that went into preparing not only the bureaucrats but also the politicians. And nobody could believe it. We thought we were going to be there long. Thanks.
Thanks for that, Danny.
And I think, sorry, Max, and I really think that had lots to do with all the work that we've done in terms of preparation. But you talked about it earlier, that one of the biggest things that we made sure was that we really communicated the agreement as much as we can, even at monthly public meetings. Even though I had nothing to say, I went and he basically said, 15 minutes of stuff about self-government, but that's one of the most important things in all of the stuff that we've done is we had to make sure we communicated the agreement. And I think that's what helped us get things through. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely, Danny. Thank you so much. Any questions on the chat feature?
No questions so far, Max. So,
okay, does anyone want to chime in?
And if any of you have any questions, feel free to send them through the chat function and I'll pass them on.
Maybe just while we're waiting on any questions to come through, I'll sort of, start the kind of my own closing thoughts. First of all, to thank everyone so much for all their time and their insights in the lead up and into this session, which is and to the Law Society again for inviting us. It's always a pleasure, and it's fun to be a part of, and it's always a good opportunity to, even for the presenters, perhaps most especially for the presenters, to learn. You learn by teaching, and so it's wonderful to have this opportunity to be part of this. In terms of, and Lorraine and Danny have really emphasized this as sort of the Herculean challenge of bringing this agreement into, breathing life into it, and the importance of that. At the end of the day, though, I remain incredibly optimistic, and it does take time. But if you look at, some of the anecdotal examples anyway of self-government, I think it's very telling that yes, it takes time, but that the benefits are there. Our firm has worked very closely with the Crees of Quebec for many decades now, and of course, the compare and contrast of the Crees of Quebec under their agreement, their James Bay Northern Quebec Agreement, which has a substantial self-government component that has been added to over the many years, and they have been, really incredibly successful over those years. And you compare and contrast their circumstances with the Indian Act bands that are just across the border in Ontario, that are the Crees of James Bay, but on the Ontario side of that kind of imaginary line, and who have continued to operate under the Indian Act, and sadly, some of those communities on the Ontario side under the Indian Act, same people, same language, same land. Those people have really struggled significantly under the Indian Act. I mean, that's just sort of a market example. If you look at Tsawwassen, which and Seashell, if you look at the Seashell band, I think it was maybe the first self-government agreement in Canada, if I'm not mistaken, or close to. They have in the last couple of years managed to get equilibrium in terms of high school graduation rates for their youth, as opposed to the non-Indigenous youth within that community. I don't think that's a coincidence. In the Yukon as well, we're seeing that. We're seeing 100% graduation rates from some communities that are operating under self-government, and importantly, that have been able to secure, the very significant and important resources to make that to make those self-government agreements a reality when it comes to the exercise of those jurisdictions. So from my perspective, there's real cause for optimism that these self-government agreements are not idle pursuits. They're incredibly important stepping stones in the process of reconciliation. And we're very lucky to have so many people on all sides, the territorial government, federal government, and within Indigenous communities themselves, taking such a tremendous leadership role in getting us there. So those are kind of my closing thoughts. I'm still not seeing any questions coming in, so maybe if I can ask Brian and then finish off with Danny with your final thoughts, and then we will wrap it up.
Okay, so very well spoken, Max. I've personally always thought that there is enormous potential in moving the self-government piece forward. The on the government side, there's a great deal more flexibility now in developing institutions. And I think one thing that seems to me to be offer quite a bit of hope and interest is the idea that when you are getting started in a self-government negotiation, the federal government is certainly open to approaching the issue of joint mandates so that you are able to sit down and discuss things perhaps in a more creative and prioritize things that reflect the interests of the community, and then avoid things that have caused roadblocks in the past when people had certain predilections or prejudgments as to what could be negotiated and what couldn't be negotiated. So there's Danny started his introduction by saying it took 20 years, and that to my mind is something that we really have to work on to avoid the incredible delays in the process, because the longer the process goes on, the more positions tend to be rigid, and people don't see the results. And so I think there's got to be a more dynamic way of starting off, possibly through working out joint mandates and working out timetables that are realistic and that will really bring the fruition of these things much closer. It's a great task, and I've certainly had been personally enriched by the experience of being involved.
Brian, Danny?
Yeah, thanks, guys, and thank you all. Thank you, Law Society, for allowing me to speak again. Don't get me wrong, even though I walked away, I watch closely as to what's going on continuously. I watch all the time, so they know that I'm always just a phone call away if they need me at the community. I've spent some time talking with other groups for about a year after I left Deline's file. I've worked with the Nuvialuit, the Gutchin, the Decho, KHO. I did presentations for about a year, and with all the intent that I wasn't going to continue doing that, I just basically wanted to tell a story and inspire people that self-government, I think, is the right way. It's when we looked at it, we were over-governed. I think we did a whiteboard of all the committees and institutions and boards and groups and governments that we had to deal with. It was overwhelming how many groups were out there that we had to deal with on a daily basis. Even the land claims, with all its corporations and committees and management boards, you wonder why people can't keep up. And one of the simple principles was that we were over-governed, and all we want to do is go hunting and fishing and live a healthy life and participate in an economy. Why is it that we can't keep up? And self-government, in my mind, is a way to simplify that, and simplify it in a way that we are becoming more efficient and more better at delivering services to our people, so that the services are actually meaning something, like they're actually producing something. Whereas right now, we get services delivered to us under the old system, and you got to fit in a box in order to qualify, for example. And if you don't fit in that box, you don't qualify. Then you got to shift to be in a circle because they changed it. And now you don't fit in a circle anymore because the policies change and the rules change. So it was ongoing for all my life that these policies are there that just don't meet the community's needs and the members' needs. And so it was really important that, in my mind, self-government allow us to take a holistic approach, integrated approach to solving our own problems. And if there are problems, we should be the ones solving them. Why are we looking to other governments to legislate and solve our problems? It was very quite simple as to what we were trying to do. And again, we had a real good team, dedicated team, and most of all, our community was committed to keeping our team intact. We have our ups and downs, but ultimately there's lots of rewards yet to come. And when people start working together and sharing and supporting and building a community together, then you've accomplished something. Whether they finish anything, don't need to worry about whether they're finishing, because they're going to, because they've simply started working together. They started communicating with one another, helping one another. That's a task in itself. I want to thank you all, and that's my closing remarks.
Thanks so much, Danny. And that's all from us. Glenn, do you want to lead us out?
Thanks, Max. And the thank yous, a couple of thank yous have poured in on the chat line. On behalf of the Law Society, I want to thank all of you. I want to thank Danny, Max, Brian, and Lorraine. This has been a very informative session. And we appreciate all the time you put into preparing for it and delivering it. And everyone, have yourself a fine weekend. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care, everyone.
Bye, Max.
Bye-bye.
Lorraine.